I'm going to speak on what some of us have been facing in the field of history. It's going to be a very pedestrian talk. I have said all this many times before, but it's amazing how those who don't wish to hear never hear. It's also amazing how those who wish to exert their particular authority do it predictably. We had the same problems in 1977, 78, and then they died down, and then we had the same problems in 2000, and in 2014, when the government changed, we all groaned and said, well, we're going to be back to the same problems again, and predictably, very predictably, we're back to the same problems again. Well, we've heard a great deal lately about development, smart cities, 15 lakhs to every citizen when the black money is recovered. What has been said in passing, however, is something which I think is much more crucial than these vague promises that have been held out. For example, the casual way in which it was said that there is no need to retain secularism as part of the Constitution. This is a very fundamental statement which I think we all passed over quietly without making too much fuss over it. It ties up, in fact, with two important directives that have come since then. One is that the writing of history has to be changed. That the new history that is going to be written will replace and correct the existing history. And please note, my emphasis is on the word correct. Secondly, it's also been said that there is going to be a cleansing of institutions who are going to be rid of cultural pollution. And cultural pollution, of course, is defined as anybody who has any kind of Western approach to understanding a problem or reads widely beyond India and brings those problems in. Westernized ideas, westernized methods of explanation. One is reminded, as far as this cultural pollution aspect is concerned, of course, of the great cultural revolution that took place in China, which was also directed against cultural pollution. And perhaps we should remind ourselves that the most shattering thing about that cultural revolution was not only what it removed from the consciousness, the awareness, the everyday living of the Chinese, but the amount of time it took to bring back normal thinking into the Chinese tradition once more. In other words, to pollute it once again. And I think that that is something that we should definitely keep in mind. History has to be rewritten because, as various people have said, history is absolutely essential to nationalisms of various kinds. We like to think that the nationalism that we support is a secular nationalism, and therefore we write rational, reasoned, secular history with a certain amount of imagination, but not too many leaps of fantasy. But of course, when it comes to religious nationalism, it becomes even more important that history be correct. The intention is to convert India into a Hindu Rashtra, because the majority of people in the country are Hindus, and to make Hindus the primary citizens. And we know all this, of course, from the detailed work that was done in the 1930s, where we were told that the Hindus are the indigenous peoples of India, and Hinduism is the religion that has its roots in India, the theory of Pitri Bhumi and Punya Bhumi. The ancestors are from India, the religion is from India. And India is always defined in this thinking, interestingly, as the territory of British India. Nobody talks about Jambudvipa or Bharatvarsha or Al-Hind. It's always the territory of British India. So Muslims, Christians, Parsis who came from outside the boundaries of British India, whose religion originated outside these boundaries, are ipso facto aliens. They're foreigners. And therefore, they don't have a right to primary citizenship, only those that are born within these boundaries, following the religion that emerged in these boundaries. The next step, of course, is to argue that the coming of Islam meant the creation of two nations. The Muslims got Pakistan, therefore it's only right that the Hindus should get Hindu Rashtra, and the definition would be that India should become a Hindu Rashtra. And therefore history has to be written in order to justify this theory of who we are, what we are, where we're at. The irony, of course, in this theory is that the history that is quoted, and it is described as the indigenous history of India. They keep on saying this is the history that, is indigenous, it's not westernized, and therefore it's not polluted. It's pure history. This history that is quoted as the indigenous history is, in fact, the very history that was written by British and European scholars. It is colonial scholarship which is at the foundation of this new so-called indigenous history. What do I mean by this? Both the religious nationalisms, Hindu and Muslim, going back to the 1920s and continuing since, are based on colonial readings of Indian history. About a century ago, 1818, James Mill periodized Indian history into Hindu civilization, Muslim civilization, and the British period, from which followed the theory of the two nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation. And the British then argued that they were the peacekeepers between these two permanently hostile, aggressive nations, constantly fighting against each other. And from this also followed the idea that we often hear of spoken these days, that the second millennium AD, that is from 1000 AD onwards, there was Muslim tyranny and the Hindus were enslaved. And I'm bothered about such statements simply because, in fact, when you look at what was happening in this period, some of the greatest works in Sanskrit philosophy, Sanskrit literature, in commentaries, in the writing of religious texts, which gave a foundation to the kind of Hinduism that we observe today, classical music, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, this is all going on in this period and going on quite openly between various groups of people who are discussing, arguing, and writing. But this notion of these two monolithic religions is absolutely fundamental and colors everything. Then there is the other point, which is still being contested in a very public way. Some of us were attacked only 4 days ago about this. And that is the origin of the Hindus. This is encapsulated in what was often described as, what some of us at least have described as, the perennial Aryans. The Hindus in origin were Aryans, and the Aryan foundation of Indian civilization was propounded by colonial scholars again, preeminently Max Muller, but many others. Max Muller argued that they came from Central Asia and came and civilized India, an idea that was taken up by Tilak, who said, yes, they came from the Arctic region. Dayanand Saraswati, who said they came from Tibet. The Arctic region was a little embarrassing because it was so far away. The North Pole was very far away. So then it was argued that in those days, when the Aryans were traveling, invading, the North Pole was actually located in Bihar. So it didn't matter. It was all within India. So that was one theory that was picked up. The foundation of Indian civilization is Aryan. Okay, the other theory that was picked up was again a theory propounded by Colonel Olcott and the Theosophists, that the Aryans were indigenous to India and that they went from India westwards and civilized the world. So this notion that the Aryans cannot have come from outside. Of course they cannot have come from outside, because if they are the originators of Hindu civilization, they have to be from within the territory of British India. They cannot come from outside. So that's a given, that you have to go on asserting that whoever has contributed to the civilization of India has to be somebody from within this territory. So you end up with the theory that Hindus are Aryans, that the Aryans go back to the beginnings of settlements in India, and I gather from the papers that now it's been pushed back to 7,500 BC or something of that kind. Anyway, and that the Aryans are, of course, indigenous. They didn't come from anywhere. So those of us that have been arguing that maybe there was a migration from neighboring lands and so on, that there are links with the Iranians and so on, no, we are distorting history because they have to be indigenous. Now, the reading of history is not just somebody's fantasy. It is a very systematic way of establishing the Hindutva view of Indian history. You have to argue these points if you're going to be consistent with what the philosophy originally said. So, history has to be rewritten. And this, it seems to me, is not just a matter of history being rewritten. If it was just us, I would say, all right, we'll battle it out as we've done in the past, and we'll go on writing our kind of history. They can go on writing their kind of history. They can go on abusing us. It seems to make not too much difference. But I think there's a very fundamental issue involved here, which is that it is an attempt to reduce all knowledge of any kind, history, non-historical, any kind of knowledge, to reduce all knowledge to a single narrative and to base that narrative on a single ideology. And that, it seems to me, is something that we should be very concerned about. And secondly, it also means that those professionally involved in exploring new knowledge, in asking questions, in questioning the existing knowledge, they are to be silenced. Now, I'm sorry, this may be ending up on a very depressing note, but I think I may be wrong. I think that there is every right for everybody to have their own opinions and to have their theories. But please, can we just discuss these theories, either in public or in our institutions? But let's not get to the point of, first of all, abusing people viciously, and then, as Gita said, assassinating them. That's not what I want from my society.